I like.
We just all wave at each other.
All right, good. Okay, so we are continuing to live stream these meetings for anyone who's still not comfortable coming out, but also we've heard from some people they can't be here. So if you really have nothing more going on in your life that you want to watch replays of Parrot Cove meetings, we will make that available for you. All right, so we got a couple events coming up, reminders. So next one, August 7th, is the swim through Parrot Cove. Saturday, it's going to be from 2 to 6. We'll get an email out to everybody. We're still finalizing the pools. As a reminder, that is our annual progressive pool party, where delectable beverages and snacks will be served at each pool. We go to them for an hour and then move along to the next ones, kind of like little locusts, consuming everyone, then moving on to the next pool. So we'll have 4 pools for that, and we'll announce the lineup probably sometime in the near future. I think we're still looking for another pool or 2. I'm looking over there. I'm looking at Ocean Breeze. It's got some nice pools on there. That's right. It's got a nice new name. It's got some nice pools on it. We're going to come over that way. I have a pool. We've got a volunteer right there. So we'll talk to you afterwards. And then the next one after that's going to be the new event, the Backyard Olympics. So the details are coming together on that one, but that's going to be a lot of fun, and that's going to be November 6th. Details are still coming together on that. So we'll announce more as we get a little closer to that. The July 4th raft race is back on this year. Yeah. Anyone know how to build a raft? Because we need someone. So if you know anybody, any carpenters or anybody with boat craftsman skills, we'd love to hear from you.
I do have a question.
Yes.
I'm brand new to this
Then
whole,
please ask your question.
what kind of raft and how long does it float and where?
Okay, so those are actually really good questions. How long does it need to float? It needs to float for at least 2 rounds of the race, which goes on at Bryant Park, and kind of goes out, Luke, what would you say, 500 feet? Is that about how far it goes? It goes about 500 feet around some buoys. It needs to float long enough from that, but unfortunately what's happened in the past is some of the other more jealous neighborhoods have attacked our raft as we've gone around and sank it.
Well, I've got pirate ships. That's what
Okay, so we'll talk after the meeting for sure then. We need some of these assets.
I love it.
I have pirates.
Okay, don't leave.
I want to know, like.
She has a pool and pirates.
Yeah.
Welcome to the neighborhood. You're our new favorite person.
You are home.
I did have to email, like, where was the
Ah, yes. You know, what's funny is every time I send out that email, I put the same thing, number 1, 7th Avenue, and I'm like, this is really redundant. Everyone knows what this is. The first time I didn't do it, you emailed me and said, what's the address of the beach club? So thank you for keeping me on my toes. But yes, we want to speak after the meeting then as well on a couple of those things. So there's a parade, as everyone remembers. So everything will be back on. I believe the NAPC is working out some details with the city just to make sure they're comfortable with how it's going to be. So that'll go on, I think it's 11 a.m., but as the details come in, we'll email them out to everyone so that way you have them. The Parrot Cove Block Party was quite a success. We saw a lot of familiar faces. A lot of the neighbors were there. Everyone had a very good time. We had just about 100 people check in. So that was really good after a long shutdown and no events and nothing, to be able to bring that back and to see everybody out there having a good time. Luke, who is also our audio-visual guy, did the cooking, and he did a fantastic job on that as well. Thank you, Luke, and everybody on the board really helped out and brought that together. So, as I've said many times, you know, the board puts in the effort to get these things going, but it wouldn't be much fun if people didn't show up. So thank you, everybody, for coming up and making that event a success yet again. On our live stream, anybody who is on there, if you want to ask a question of our presenters once we get going, you can use the chat function to do that. So we're going to start with Bill's going to give us, Bill is our PBSO liaison. He's been doing that for a while. Thanks, Bill. And he's going to give us a quick update on the last meeting.
Yeah, it was the first meeting after a very long break. We had a PBSO monthly meeting with Captain Bear, and he summarizes the issues, the problems, the crime stuff that's going on. And it's useful in the sense that I think we have a pretty good situation. That being said, the day that we had the meeting, an hour and a half later, Starbucks kind of like ruined their whole day. But with that exception, we're doing okay. Two issues that people should really be aware of. Lock your cars, folks. The problems seem to be problems of opportunity, thefts of opportunity. Individuals cruising by, checking car doors. They're very concerned about firearms being left in vehicles. That seems to be an issue. If you're going to do it, lock the car. And the second item is there's been some petty thefts. Bicycles seem to be the hot item. By comparison to other parts of the city, we're doing really okay. So that's that. If anybody's interested, I sent Anthony a link to the statistics because there's a map put out by PBSO. They're really very thorough. They're very conscientious. They do a great job with analytics. So if you're interested, Anthony has the link. If you want to get onto it, if you're interested, you can email me or talk to me, and I'll get you onto the mailing list. But it's open information. You get a crime scene map and things like that. That's really all I have to say. We started out. Next meeting is this week. So here we go. Yes.
What about the bicycle gang that's been riding around? They almost ride bicycles.
Kids. As I understand it, they're mostly towards West Palm Beach.
No, they were on Lake this
They're
weekend.
on 7th Federal 3 days ago. Blocking traffic.
I will bring it up and find out, as my understanding, they were towards West Palm. Yeah, it's about 30 kids, young men, 13, 15, or so, riding bicycles, and being generally obnoxious. Yeah, they're aware of it, but nothing has been done yet. I'll see you next month.
All right. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, they're pretty nasty, but they're kids.
Yeah, no, I get that. I just wonder if at some point.
I will bring it up at the next meeting and get you an answer on it. That I think is what we have to do, is just alert people to this is what's going on and just be aware. And eventually the pressure on these kids is going to be, I think, enough to maybe reform them.
All right. Good enough. Thanks very much, Bill. Appreciate the update. Okay, so we move on to our speakers. As you know, we let everybody know the purpose of this meeting is to update and bring forth some information on the, generally speaking, the FEMA map changes. So the first thing I want to say is that our speakers tonight did not make those changes. So you can't be angry with them. They are communicating that information to us to help us work with that better, especially because our area is largely affected by that, pretty much going over to, and when I looked at maps loosely, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, it, pretty much the line's moving to just about federal, for the most part. Is that a fair statement? So all of Parrot Cove will pretty much drop into a flood zone, and then there's some other changes, and then it relates to a number of other things. So we thought it was pretty important to hear from our city staff directly on that and how it's going to relate to everybody. So we have with us speaking tonight will be Peter Ringel, who's our building official, but also the flood plan administrator, and Aaron Sita, who's with us, and Jordan Hodges. Abe, are you speaking at all tonight? Okay, so Abe's the computer guy, so we'll just leave him over there. Okay, guys, if you want to come up and give us your information, thanks very much for coming out.
So we'll make that as even as we can. It's sort of crooked, so just kind of, you know. Good evening. My name is Erin Sita. I'm the Assistant Director of Community Sustainability. That department is over planning, zoning, historic preservation, building, and code enforcement. Primarily we're here tonight to speak about the change in the flood maps. These were modifications that were rolled out by FEMA in January of last year. So just a little bit of background, because we don't often get to speak with neighbors directly. I've come to the city, I started in June of last year. I have 20 years of planning and zoning experience in Palm Beach County, administering a variety of local government programs, and I've worked both in the public and private sector, and I have a master's degree in urban and regional planning. So I'd like to introduce my team so you get to know us, and we're your local, basically your local experts and your staff that work in the historic district. So, Jordan.
I'm Jordan Hodges, originally from West Virginia. Went to school at Savannah College of Art and Design and studied another fella. Nice. And studied historic preservation there. I worked in Savannah for a little bit and then Nashville, and then accepted the position here for Lake Works program in 2016.
Where in West Virginia?
Right outside Charleston, Winfield.
We wanted to secede from you. From where?
Nice, yeah, I know where.
Abe, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So I'm Abraham Fogel, preservation planner. I work alongside Jordan, working in historic preservation. And oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're fighting with farmers.
So I said I'm Abe. I'm preservation planner. Jordan and I we run the historic preservation division for the city. We also review for zoning. I have background in architecture and a master's in urban and regional planning. My undergraduate degree is from Andrews University of Michigan, and then I went to Florida Atlantic University for my master's.
So he went to FAU for his master's, and I'm really loud because I've been doing neighborhood meetings for 20 years, so I don't have a problem projecting. So poor Abe, we don't usually inflict neighborhood meetings on him, you know. So, but he's a really we have wonderfully trained staff in our planning, zoning, and historic preservation. It's a really special to have such qualified people working who have design experience. And one of the things that Abe touched on that we'll get to later is that in the city, your historic preservation staff are also your zoning staff. So it's a one-stop shop. A lot of times in Delray, you'll get historic review, and then you'll go to zoning review. That's not how it happens in Lake Worth. In Lake Worth, you come in, you apply, you get your zoning and your historic preservation, and then that moves through the process. And we're really proud to say that in our historic preservation program, probably 90% or more of the applications that come in go directly to building permit. They don't go through our public hearing process. So we try to really provide a high level of customer service to get people where they need to be through the outside of the public hearing process and using our design guidelines. So you'll see some of that, and we'll walk you through a little bit of that at the end. So just especially because I hear we have some new folks to the neighborhood. So and then last, of course, but not least, is our building official. One of the most important people in the city is the building official. Of course, Peter, can you introduce yourself?
My name is Peter Ringel, as stated earlier. I came to the city of Lake Worth Beach as building official in 2018, so I've been here almost 3 years. But I have extensive background in construction. I got my first contractor's license in 1985 in Virginia. I moved to Florida in 96, and I have my general contractor's license in Florida. I've been doing the building inspecting, plan review, and building official job for roughly 15 years. I am a certified floodplain manager since 2010, and I'm also a certified coastal and floodplain inspector. So that's my background in flood management. But I've been a resident of unincorporated Palm Beach County, Lake Worth, for 26 years. So I have extensive experience in this area. So thank you for having me here tonight. Hopefully I can pass on some good information to you.
And so we're a small city, so for all of the historic districts, and which is about a third of the area of the entire city, your planning and zoning staff are Abe and Jordan. So we don't have a tremendous depth of staff. So pretty much you have about half of the zoning division here this evening. So if you can go ahead and get started. So tonight we're here to talk about the National Flood Insurance Program, and or the NFIP. And this is administered by FEMA. Everybody knows FEMA. And one of the biggest components of the flood mapping, or of the flood insurance program, is flood mapping. And that determines ultimately your flood insurance rate, which is why these maps are called flood insurance rate maps, firm maps, right? You may have heard that. So for compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program, the city reviews new construction and renovation projects for compliance with the program requirements. In particular, in areas where you are renovating or constructing an addition or a new structure in a floodplain, if that area has what's called a base flood elevation, and we'll get into that later, that's one of your reviews, is how high is your house where your finished floor is. The city also participates in the community rating system, which is super great for residents because participation in our CRS system provides you with a 7 to 15% discount depending on the things that you do. Some of those things are public information, like we're doing tonight. Some of those things are reporting, permit review, compliance review with base flood elevation, and Peter can go into a whole lot more that I don't know off the top of my head. Next slide, please. So again, the CRS is a voluntary program. The city participates in this on a voluntary basis to provide flood insurance discounts to our residents. Rates are, so basically the idea is you have your flood risk. We're doing these activities that are these permitted activities, right? We get points for those activities, and those activities are intended to reduce flood risk. And so you get a discount because you're less likely to be flooded because of the stuff that the city is engaging in. The goals of the National Flood Insurance Program are to reduce and avoid flood damage to insurable property, strengthen and support insurance aspects of the NFIP, and then also to foster comprehensive floodplain management. FEMA is a wealth that if you're interested in floodplain management or you're interested in anything FEMA, they have a wonderful all kinds of publications that are really accessible to folks that can walk you through the community rating system and flood protection as well. Next slide. So our new, I'm gonna give you the outline so you know what the story is gonna be, and then we're gonna tell the story, right? So we have the firm maps, they were published in January 2020. So Peter's gonna talk about that. We have our base flood elevation. When do we need to elevate structures? What is a substantial improvement? And finally, historic preservation and the National Flood Insurance Program, specifically a base flood elevation variance. Next slide, please. So, what are some of the impacts of these new maps that we're seeing? New constructions, additions, expansions, renovations, especially those that are substantial improvements, and we'll talk about what that is. That is a technical definition. Within a flood zone will be required to elevate, sometimes at significantly higher elevations. There are areas of the city where you need to elevate to 12 feet above sea level. What does that mean? That's not here in your neighborhood. But figure elevation in the city is roughly 3 to 4 feet NAVD. That is our measuring stick, right? In Europe you use centimeters. Here you use inches. To measure relative sea level rise, we use NAVD. So that's your measuring stick. So our actual elevation, right, Peter, did I get that right? 3 to 4 feet? Okay, I always got to check with the expert. And so some parts, especially along South Lakeside, they were going to have some elevation requirements of 12 feet above that. So they'll be required to elevate structures sometimes as much as 8 feet, which will have a significant impact depending on the neighborhood. In your general neighborhood, the base flood elevation is generally around 8 feet. 9 feet with your freeboard requirement. So you're looking at an elevation of around 5 feet for existing structures, still impactful. So other impacts of the maps are larger areas will be required to obtain and maintain flood insurance. Flood insurance is required if you have a mortgage, if you're in a floodplain. Contributing and structures in historic districts will still have some exemptions from elevation requirements. And we've actually had some folks who were not contributing who became eligible to be designated contributing to self-designate contributing so that they could take advantage of this base flood elevation variance because they were renovating their house. And we'll get into why they were going to need to elevate their house. So, and again, part of why we're rolling out this information is we're concerned of the overall character and streetscapes will likely change over time. So we want to present this information to you so you're aware. And we're going to be looking at things in the future, design guidelines and those sorts of things to start looking as homes, new construction continues to happen and renovation happens, how to mitigate. There are ways you can design a home to mitigate the impact on the surrounding neighborhood. Next. So again, new maps were released in early 2020. They'll be officially adopted in 2021. But FEMA has given us a letter in January saying, guess what? You all get to use the maps now. So we've been implementing the new maps since January 20th, 2020. And we already hit on that, so go ahead and go. So you can't really see this well, and I just want to give you the kind of blush of this, but the county has a really great website. And how you get to this website where you can look up your actual house is you just Google flood map PBC. And it takes you to this link that's like, what does it say? It says Palm Beach County Maps. It's a little link, and you'll see something like this. And it'll tell you what the existing floodplain and then what the proposed. So we are implementing the proposed floodplain at FEMA's direction. All right. So this is the proposed is essentially your effective flood zone. There is a legal process to go through the adoption of the maps. FEMA has not completed that, but they're requiring coastal cities to utilize the new maps because that is the best available data. Next slide. So just giving you some before and after, we did some snippets. You can see here, this is kind of what is your X500. Have you guys heard of the X500 zone, right? That's where you're like in a flood zone, but it's like a baby flood zone, right? Right, you're in the baby flood zone, so you don't have to elevate there. But in this one, which is going to be your AE zone or your VE zone, you have to elevate in those zones. So if you come over here and you can kind of see the after, you can see these little polka dotted area. That is now your X500 zone, which means everything, you can see this is downtown, this is Lucerne, this is Lake, and you can kind of see here's Federal Highway. This X500 zone is now over here, where before, here's Federal, it was over here. So it's moved, we've moved that X500 zone closer to Federal, and then we've moved this AE zone, or rather FEMA has that's come over and followed. And the X500 zone is kind of narrowed a little bit. Not everywhere, but for generally speaking. Go ahead and go to the next one. Again, this is a sample, this is College Park, this is not you all, but you can kind of see here, we kind of picked the areas where there was a lot of shift. And you can kind of see here's that, again, that X500, and those zones that kind of shifted over. And then you can see now, again, the polka dots and the shift. And one more. And then that again. And then Peter, I think I went too far. I think you're supposed to take this and talk about the limois and the other things that are you. So I'm going to turn this over to Peter.
So to explain what happened, FEMA started in 2016 and they did a survey, of the entire coastline of Florida, from Jacksonville all the way through or around through the Gulf. So what they did is they did new wave studies throughout the entire coast for two reasons. Number one, the data they were using was from the 1970s, and the topography has changed. The beach has shrunk. You know, because if any of you are longtime residents here, you'll know that A1A used to be on the other side of the condominiums back in the 60s. And when the hurricane came through, they moved it to the west side of the condominiums. So there's a lot of beach erosion that's happened. And so these new studies bear out the fact that there have been changes to the topography and also with the sea level rise. So that was all taken into effect. And what that means for the residents is, again, what places that used to be in the 500-year flood zone are now in the 100-year flood zone. What they have also done is they did wave studies, and there are places along the intercoastal that are now what's called a coastal A zone. So they have to design for 1 to 3 feet of wave action in those areas. They cannot support a house on fill. So you're talking about deep foundations pilings, and you're talking about elevations in a V zone. The 12-foot or 11-foot elevations in those areas are to the lowest horizontal structural member. So that's the bottom of your grade beam. So you're not talking about 12 feet of elevation for your finished floor. You're talking about 14 to 15 feet of elevation for the first floor. So with these changes in the maps, okay, you can't really see this too well, but anything here, right along the coast, if you follow the line, there's a little blue line and the dots change. That is the wave action zone. It doesn't affect too many parcels because most people don't build that far back on their lot, but it is a very big deal in other places.
And Peter, it's where the structure is located that
It
dictates
is,
the flood zone.
right. Your flood zone is determined by the footprint of the building. You can have a VE zone, which is right out here by the golf course, but if the foundation, your footprint of the building is not in the VE zone, you're actually in an A zone. So,
Yeah, and Parrot Cove is actually one of the least impacted neighborhoods in the city because of the golf course. So the VE zone here is really in the golf course, and you don't get those high elevation requirements, which is why it's only really 4, maybe 5 feet this way, you know.
and the other major change in the map is what used to be 6 is now 8. You know, what was 7 is now 9. So they added 2 feet of elevation in most places. In some places, they added 3 feet. And there's a couple places, especially on the south end in this area here, where they actually went and they now have 4 feet of elevation. So, you know, it's a rather significant change. So if anybody in this room has a house and they're in an X zone now, or they're in no flood zone, you can get your flood insurance now as a preferred risk policy, and you're grandfathered in. The latest update on the maps since we did this presentation is by the end of this year, the maps will become effective. Okay, Palm Beach County has challenged the maps, but you know, it's my understanding from FEMA that the challenges are going to be resolved rather quickly because they want the new maps involved. Okay, Florida pays 50% of the premiums to the National Flood Insurance Program throughout the nation. Okay, and we receive 15% of the claims for the flood insurance are made in Florida. Okay, so Florida pays a rather hefty premium, and there's not a lot of return on money, return on investment. But there are programs out there. They're talking about starting another flood insurance program outside of FEMA for Florida, much like Citizens. But that remains to be seen, what happens with that. That's in the planning stages. You know, and that's something that just came about recently. It was talked about in the CRS users group. What's Community Rating Service? We get audited, the city of Lake Worth Beach, every year. They want to know how many permits were issued in the floodplain, how many new buildings were built, and they want to see every elevation certificate. Okay, every 5 years the city is audited. Coming up November this year, we have our 5-year recertification audit. The last time Lake Worth Beach had an audit, they were thrown out of the program. So a lot of work has happened. Okay, we went from a 0, okay, discount to a 15% discount. Okay, 5% of that happened while I was here. Okay, and we're working on keeping our rating because they're changing the rules of the game to take away some of the discounts, and we're trying to do more to keep the discounts. But we're audited every year, and every 5 years they come and do a major audit, okay, where they go through our records and they make sure everything's tip-top and spot on.
Gone are the days when FEMA was kind of hands-off. In fact, I worked, I was a consultant for another city in Palm Beach County, and they actually almost lost their ability to issue building permits in the city because they were not implementing their floodplain program. So FEMA is really getting serious the last decade about implementing, making sure that local governments are implementing their floodplain program. And Peter, if you can just kind of point out, you can see we have the map here. This is your neighborhood, and you can see that VE zone is pretty much, that big zone is all on the golf course. And really for you all, it's that AE zone, which is 8 feet.
So we had one question in the back.
Yes, where is this coming from? Who is driving this change? Is it a FEMA change, or is this coming from the city?
This is, everybody heard about the Bright Waters Act that we called the Muddy Waters Act of 2000 and something, where the Congress got together and said, hey, the FEMA's flood insurance program is revamped. This whole mapping is part of, a it's almost been a decade that they've been working on this project to update the maps and update the, the premiums. And as far as to get more premiums, I'll leave that up to the politicians to decide. Okay, but really, if you look at, okay, I was with the surveyor a couple weeks ago at a property, and they were kind enough to give me some data, okay? On the north end of the island where we were on Notre Dame Drive, they're at 2.7 feet for the road, okay? The flood zone in that area is 9 feet, finished floor. Okay, so that gives you an idea. That's, just on Notre Dame Drive, that's huge. 7 feet for the finished floor. Yes?
Follow-up question. Have they taken into consideration the fact that everything from where you're standing north is still land which came from the Palm Beach inlet, was blown in and filled up? Is there any thought being given to adding to that and therefore mitigating the flood?
So as far as the bringing in fill on submerged lands, okay, I was the building official in Riviera Beach for 4.5 years, and they have significant portions of Singer Island where they have submerged lands and bringing in fill, okay, and to the best of my knowledge, you have to get special permits to bring in fill, and they're not issuing them. Okay, so bringing in fill and creating, buffers, for submerged land, I do not see it happening unless there's a major change within the laws of the state of Florida.
And water tends to find a way, it's like, if you block it here, then more goes there. So the problem is that whenever there's been a lot of different studies in looking at ways to mitigate sea level rise and mitigate flooding, and a lot of them have to do with, actually, the studies have shown that natural systems do the best job, and we don't have a lot of natural systems left, so restoration of wetlands, those kind of things have more impact, because what happens is if you put a seawall here, sorry, yeah. So sometimes what happens if you put a seawall here, then over there, it floods more than your other neighbor. So this is way
questions?
Our alleyways. So Parrot Cove, I think we all have alleys. Some of them are paved and some of them are dirt alleys. And I don't know how that impacts flood zone or risk impact at all.
No impact whatsoever. It's 2.7 feet. When I was out there with the surveyor last week, we measured right in front of 2010 Notre Dame Drive, okay? And they had their GPS, and it was, well, like I said, I can only go by the data I was given, but that's what the elevation is, 2.76 feet. And that's NAVD, not NGVD, because there's a difference between NA and NG. NG, the 9 foot is NAVD. What's the street? The street was 2.7 NAVD. So what happened is when they adopted the maps in 2016, they went from NGVD to NAVD. It's like going from the English standard system to the metric system. They changed the measuring point. So this 2.7 is actually 4.3 NGVD. So they lowered the number and raised the elevation. So there's a huge change.
It's measuring.
It's 4.5, whatever the other one is.
Correct,
but it's 2.7, the new.
And Moore Street might be different. This was one particular street. So
Yep.
there's different streets at different elevations, and it's just the measuring stick. That the point that's measured doesn't say, it's just the number of measurement. And they just.
Then why did the city, when they redid Notre Dame, why did the city at Wellesley and Notre Dame, where the drain is, that was supposed to be elevated so that the water doesn't come back into Notre Dame, address up north?
So-
Why was that not done?
Right, so you're getting a far field. We don't work in the public works division. We're here to talk about the base up flood elevation, and that's a road project. That's a whole different, and I don't have that information.
And that would be a question for Brian Shields
Yes.
and
And I'm sure there's a reason for that. We can get you the right person who you can email and get that answer. But we really need to get through this because there's important information for the neighborhood. So let's get back to base flood elevation.
okay, so base flood elevation is your finished, your where the flood is intended to be. Throughout the entire state of Florida, we have higher standards, higher regulations, so we have to go base flood elevation plus 1 foot. Okay, so everybody who's building new additions, substantial improvements, they need to be at base flood plus 1. Okay? The other thing is in an A zone, a coastal A zone, it's the top of the wave. So a coastal A zone is expected to have 1 to 3 foot waves. Okay? So this picture here kind of, this is your A zone, this is your AE, coastal A, and VE. So it's both. But the, they've added coastal A zone and VE zone along the intercoastal side, which was not there on the last map. Now, something for you to take into account is your flood insurance premiums. It's based on your finished floor elevation and your elevation certificate. If you are base flood plus 1, now I'm going from the 2012 data tables, those are the last one I've had access to. But base flood plus 1 was 43 cents per $100 of insured value. Base flood is 77 cents per $100 of insured value. Base flood minus 1 is $1.77 per $100 of insured value. Okay? I had buildings on Singer Island, when the new maps became effective, they went from they went from 43 cents per $100 of insured value to $7.70 per $100 of insured value, because they went from an X zone
to a VE zone because they changed the definition. So there are some huge changes that can happen with these maps. So like I said, if you don't have flood insurance now and you have a mortgage or you have neighbors, please pass this information on to them because again, the preferred risk policy right now, 43 cents per $100 looks great, and then you can only go up a certain amount per year until you reach parity. Well, that's a long time at 5 or 10% a year to reach that. Because again, your premiums could triple.
What is the dollar based on? Is it based on your assessed value or?
So the way the flood insurance maps are, they have so many dollars per $100 of insured value. And that is set by, is your house pre-firm, post-firm? Pre-firm means before FEMA came into effect. Post-firm means after the maps came into effect. Okay? And there's a whole, it's a whole new language. And you know, if you have questions, you can ask your flood insurance agent about it and what the map changes mean. Because these map changes are out there. The flood zones are out there. If you want to contact the building department, I can tell you what your old flood zone is and what your new flood zone is.
The best thing to do is contact an insurance agent to get your quote and, you know, shop around and see what kind of quote you're gonna get. Ready?
So, remodeling projects, rehabilitation projects, this is where most people are gonna have problems. Okay, I've had people come in, I'm going to renovate my house, I'm going to put a small addition on, and all of a sudden, I'm at a substantial improvement. What does that mean? Okay, a substantial improvement is defined by FEMA as an improvement that exceeds 50% of the market value. Market value is the key. Market value of the property pre-improvement, okay? And that can be determined a couple of ways. If you don't have an appraisal of your property, I'm going to determine the market value of the structure by the property appraiser's website, which is usually 30 to 50% low, depending upon conditions. So if you have a market value of a house of $50,000, okay, and you want to go and change your windows and change your roof, you're already up at a substantial improvement and you have to elevate your house, because it's more than $50,000 worth of value. So,
And this is what's important to understand here is it's the market value of the structure. So
not the land.
Yeah, so a lot of people come in and talk to Peter and they're like, well, I bought my house for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. Well, that is not your market value of your structure. It's your actual home, the building itself. So that's different than your land value. And a lot of what our value is in Parrot Cove is the land value. So.
And there are a couple of things you can do. You can get a licensed real estate appraiser to give you a real estate appraisal of the pre-improvement value. It will be reviewed to make sure it's appropriately done. And I've already had 4 people this year alone provide me with appraisals to avoid the substantial improvement. But if you're doing a substantial improvement and you're more than 50% of the value of the structure, you need to elevate to the new flood elevation. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think there is a single house in the historic district that's going to meet the new floor elevations. Most of them are going to be 1 foot to 1.5 feet low. That's what I'm seeing, you know, all throughout the city. Yes, sir.
So the elevation is only for the addition, or do you have to raise your house?
So, that's a very broad question with so many different wheels. When you turn one knob, it turns 6 other knobs. So, sir, if you're doing an addition, okay, and it is a lateral addition, which means just to the side, okay, you may not have to elevate if it isn't a substantial improvement, but there are certain conditions to that. Is it a pre-firm house? Is it a post-firm house? And there's a manual of about 300, well, 300 is an exaggeration, but it's probably 50 pages of different conditions, and then you have these to go through. But that is, I can't answer it. I can answer it on an individual basis per lot.
And another question, which is probably out of your wheelhouse, but is an insurance policy transferable? Flood insurance policy transferable? I don't have a mortgage. I'm not carrying flood insurance.
It's not. You can't take insurance policy from another property to another property. Or
No, if I got one now and sold my house,
No, my parents that just happened to
whoever
them.
buys it, they own it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but check with your insurance.
Yes.
I do have a question regarding the floodplain, and I know we're talking about Parrot Cove right now. If you have a property that's closer to Dixie, one, and you want to make a substantial improvement, and it is probably, it's like a 1938 house, so that would be moved by FEMA. Would you still need to raise everything up back there, or is that?
It's a baby question. If you want to reach out to me in my office, we can go through the specifics of what the criteria would be for that individual lot. Because
But
again,
if it's not in a flood zone, you don't have to. There's no requirement, and depending on where you are in the flood zone, there's a different elevation requirement depending on where you are. So you have to really.
I'm a little fuzzy on the flood zone right there.
Yeah, if you're closer to Dixie, you may not be in a flood zone. So, I will just say, we're going to do a little transition to Jordan, who's our preservation coordinator. And in FEMA, one of the only places, in fact, one of the main places for relief from the elevation requirement is if you have a contributing structure, you can apply for a base flood elevation variance. And because we have a floodplain manager, and because we're designated, we have a certified local government for historic. Jordan's going to walk through that. But because you are in a historic district, and if you have a contributing house, and you're required to elevate, you don't have to elevate if you're granted a base flood elevation. So this is a huge benefit if you have a historic structure, because it's preservation of the structure. And FEMA has acknowledged that, basically if we're raising structures 4 feet, they may not be able to physically be raised structures effectively without major renovation, and it may change the character of the structure itself. So because of this is probably, I think, it's one of the only ways you can get a variance from it, right, Peter?
Mm-hmm. The historic exemption, to the best of my knowledge, is the only exemption to the FEMA flood regulations that there are.
So you are in a historic district and you have that opportunity, and almost nobody else does, unless you're a designated area. So, go ahead.
Okay. So just a little background on our program and kind of your neighborhood. But Lake Worth Beach currently has 6 local historic districts, which take up about 2,700 parcels in the city. Now, most of those parcels are located east of Federal Highway. Your all's neighborhood over here is made up of 2 districts. It's the Old Lucerne Local District, which is also a National Register district. And then you all take up the kind of northeast corner of the Northeast Lucerne Historic District, excluding North Gulfview Road. North Gulfview is not in the historic district. So within historic districts, there are 2 types of buildings. There are contributing buildings, which meet the designation criteria. So when historic districts are surveyed, they're surveyed using criteria set forth by the National Park Service to be able to determine if the building has the character-defining features, to make sure that it's still somewhat in original form, that it can be, effectively called a historic building in a district. Then there is also non-contributing buildings. And those are generally buildings that were built outside of the historic district's period of significance. So both of these historic districts, the period of significance for them is from about 1915 to 1945. So if your house was built during that time period and it still kind of reflects what it looked like originally, chances are you're going to be a contributing building. So our historic districts were surveyed primarily between the late 90s and the early 2000s. So there is a criteria when you are going to designate historic properties that those properties be at least 50 years old. That's your minimum benchmark to be considered historic. So a lot of our mid-century properties that were built in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, still primarily have a non-contributing designation status because they weren't old enough to be considered contributing when the districts were originally surveyed. Now the historic preservation staff, our division, was able to get about $200,000 worth of grant funding between 2015 and 2020, and we resurveyed every structure within our historic district. And what that kind of showed us was that most of the non-contributing buildings in our historic district are now eligible for a contributing status. Now, those new surveys have yet to be adopted, but they are on hand. So if you, we'll kind of get into this a little bit later, but if you are currently a non-contributing building and it sounds like you might want to move into the contributing category to take advantage of the base flood elevation exemption, if the new surveys support that you own a contributing building, you can do that administratively. We can change your designation status.
People might want to be aware of other things that come with being a contributing historic property as well.
We're going to get to that.
Not just the flood insurance benefit. I have a contributing property. I know some of the other problems that come along with it if you're trying to work on the house.
Well, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
So if you're located outside of a historic district, and this, so if you live on Gulfview, if you have friends outside of the historic districts and they have a house that you think would meet designation criteria, and those are all listed in our historic preservation ordinance. You can also go for an individual designation to become a historic structure. Again, this is your neighborhood here outlined. Like we were talking about earlier, the southern section of your neighborhood is the Old Lucerne District. The northern half is going to be part of the Northeast Lucerne District. So being a historic structure, being a designated structure, requires a review of any sort of exterior alterations that you're going to make to that building, to make sure that once you make them, the building is still considered historic afterwards. Now, our historic preservation ordinance allows for you to replace things like roofs, windows, doors, and siding materials. You can upgrade all of that to an impact product, but those products have to replicate what the original products were, or something that would be appropriate for the time it was built and the architectural style of the building. So our historic preservation design guidelines, how they're kind of structured is Lake Worth is primarily built or primarily utilizes about 10 different architectural styles, all the way from the early 1900s to the kind of 50s is where our kind of period of significance it is. So you can research your house style, see appropriate types of windows, what types of siding materials were used on your structure based on the architectural type, what type of roofing materials are appropriate, whether that's a barrel tile for mission structures or a metal shingle roof for a minimal traditional. So our design guidelines are an excellent tool for you to kind of look and see what compatible replacement materials are. But I will go ahead and say, the design guidelines are incredibly useful, but if you live in a historic district and if you are planning on making alterations to your house, Abraham and myself are your best resources. So just give us a call, shoot us an email. If you're wanting to do window replacement at your house, we'll come out to your house and give you a kind of a rundown of what can be approved administratively, so that when you get your quotes from your window contractor, they're quoting you from the right thing right off the bat. So it's not that difficult of a process if you kind of loop us in early, and we can just kind of discuss everything before you get the ball rolling.
And we really provide
time when we will actually get to speak face to face?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We've been doing this for a while with Abraham, and we've never seen him before.
Yeah, so lots of emails, lots of.
So-
No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. You're wrong. So our offices are open now by appointment. So if you all want to call, or if you all want us to come out to your property, we can do that as well.
Out there, it's got lines stuff in it.
Yeah.
There's a guy in a trench
And
coat.
look, I'll just speak to that. You gotta understand, this is half of our zoning division. So, we are just now, yeah, and a lot of our employees are in their twenties. So they're still going through the process of being vaccinated. And if, I don't know if you've heard what happened in Delray, but half of their public hearing staff got taken out and they got shut down. So if we get shut down by, we get 4 people sick in the office, there's no building permits that go out until they come back. Like the whole place gets shut down because there's 5 people who do that. So we have been very COVID cautious, I will say that. And there's a purposeful reason. We have been working our tails off. Building permits and building permit review are at 25%. Site plan review is at 225%. We typically get 1 plan development a year. We processed 7 this year. We are in there working, and we're working extended hours. I usually put in a 50-hour week these days between meetings and whatever. That's my average day. So, but I know, but sometimes people have the impression because they can't come into the building and we're pushing the Zoom, they think that we're not working. We're actually working harder and more efficiently, and we've had to really innovate our workflow because of the volume. I mean, you guys have seen what's happening in your neighborhoods, the renovations, the construction costs are through the roof because, so we are in there and we are working very hard, so.
And I would just like to add, when I started in Lake Worth Beach as building official in 2018, it was 3 months. 3 months to get a permit through the historic department. Jordan and Abraham have streamlined it, so it's now, for most permits, it's 1 to 2 weeks. So kudos to these guys for what they've done.
I was just saying that we've been dealing with Abraham for a couple of months now.
It's been done.
And we've never actually laid eyes on it.
Yeah.
The thing has happened, but.
Yeah, and I don't see the meetings beforehand, I only see from the time of permit submittal until the time the permit's issued.
No, it was very efficient.
Let's keep going.
So we were just talking about our design guidelines. We also have a document that was also funded by a state grant, which are our education guidelines for historic districts. Those are also a great tool for project planning, resiliency and sustainability planning. And you can check those out on our website. So top toolbar, go to business, scroll down to historic preservation, and they're kind of right there on the front. So there's the design guidelines and the education guidelines. Again, really, really great tools. They were, so make sure to check those out.
The education guidelines are just information, they're not regulatory, but
Yes.
the design guidelines are adopted, and those are like an extension of our code.
So as Aaron and Peter were saying earlier, the only exemption to having to raise a structure due to a substantial improvement in the Florida Building Code, the only exceptions are for designated historic structures. So that's kind of where we were talking about the contributing, non-contributing buildings. Non-contributing buildings are just buildings that are located within a historic district boundary. So only the contributing buildings are going to be eligible for these exemptions. And there's one big caveat to that. So the exception to that rule is if the program that designated the building as historic determines that it will continue to be a historic building after the proposed work is completed. And again, we were talking about this, so Lake Worth would fall under category 3 because we are a historic preservation program run by an official municipality. And what that kind of means is Lake Worth Beach's Historic Preservation Division is accredited through the state of Florida's Division of Historic Resources through their Certified Local Government program. So that kind of makes us eligible these exemptions. So when we were talking about how the structure has to still maintain its contributing status. So if you're wanting to do an addition, or as Peter was saying earlier, if you have a low valuation of your structure, if your value on Papa for just your structure is $100,000, and you're going to be doing windows, if you're going to put a new roof on, if you're going to be doing a new kitchen, updating your bathrooms, you're likely going to exceed that substantial improvement value, which would cause you to have to raise your entire structure. So this exemption allows you to do that substantial improvement without it being technically considered a substantial improvement if the work that you're going to be doing is historic preservation ordinance and design guidelines compliant. So as we were talking about, it's very important that you kind of loop Abraham and I in early on your project to make sure that what you're proposing is going to be able to be approved by our program. Now, anyone seeking a historic preservation exemption for their project, that project is going to have to be reviewed by the Historic Resources Preservation Board. And that is a group of 7 individuals. They're appointed by commission, but they are residents here in the city. And they are kind of experts on the subject. We've got a couple architects, realtors, contractors, people who are knowledgeable of our building stock, people who are knowledgeable about historic preservation efforts here in the community. And they review these applications on a case-by-case basis. I will say that everyone who has requested a historic preservation exemption has been approved thus far. Ordinance, section 23.7-7, that's our variances and appeals section. So this would, a historic preservation ordinance for the flood exemption would fall under this as well. This just adds the, kind of reiterates some information that the variance is the minimum necessary to preserve the historic character and the design of the building. And the reason that these, that historic buildings are open to this variance is because if someone was doing a substantial improvement to one of our little frame cottages here in the city, to elevate that building 8 feet in the air completely changes the character of that building, changes its massing, changes its presence on the street, and it can really be detrimental to that building and to the surrounding buildings, because Lake Worth Beach, our historic districts, specific property in the city. It's really when you take all of these buildings as a whole that they really become special. So if these properties ended up, raising, you get a really odd street presence, something that's not really in our character. So this is a great tool, and the state of Florida was really kind of proactive in thinking about this and thinking about historic districts when they included this into their building code. So I'm going to give you an example. You all are probably going to be familiar with this structure. It is in your neighborhood. So this is 312 North Palm Way. This house has been under construction for a while now. So the current owners, it's a property developer who purchased the property back in the end of 2019. This is a what would be considered a frame minimal traditional house. So it was, kind of think of your GI Bill housing, very simple frame structures from the late 30s, early 40s. It had seen some alterations over time. The original windows had been removed. There was this big carport addition on the front of it. Had slight alterations, but it still really retained the character from when it was constructed. You can go ahead. So they purchased the property. They wanted to make some alterations to it. Basically a full interior renovation, new plumbing, new electric, new kitchens, new bath. They also wanted to do some exterior alterations to it. So they came and talked to Abraham and myself. We actually had the original architectural drawings for the building in our property files. It was an Edgar Wortman property from 1939. He was one of our more prolific architects from the period. They came up with, after they worked with us, they were going to take off the carport addition and reconstruct what that original garage appearance looked like. They were taking out the jalousie windows and installing new impact products that kind of replicated what was there originally. Not a tremendous amount of work on the exterior, but we'll review any sort of exterior alteration. Go ahead. So where they kind of got into trouble, they submitted their application, and we were able to approve, or excuse me, Abraham and I were able to issue their certificate of appropriateness, which is your historic preservation permit. And then they, when they got to the building permit, Peter actually realized that their valuation of their application was over their substantial improvement value. So they were going to have to raise the structure 18 inches, which by their estimates was going to add about $20,000 to $30,000 to their application. So what they did was they went and got, like Peter was saying earlier, a private assessment of the structure, which ended up being significantly higher than what property appraiser had. So they went ahead and Peter worked with them and issued the permit application. So they started work on the property, but of course in historic buildings sometimes when you start to open up walls, things happen. The building had a severe amount of termite damage, and then they also determined that the building needed a new roof. When you added the cost of the roof to their permit value, they were again through their substantial improvement. But again, because they worked with historic preservation staff early and came up with a good rehabilitation plan, we went ahead and took this structure to the HRPB, who then granted the variance for the base flood elevation. So even though they crossed their substantial improvement threshold, because the work that they were doing to the exterior of the structure was still compatible and in line with our design guidelines and historic preservation ordinance, they were able to get that exemption. So they're now moving forward. They just put the siding and windows in. It's starting to look really good. Okay. This is another property on South Lakeside Drive. It's just north of South Bryant Park, I believe. And this was a mid-1950s kind of mid-century ranch. It was a non-contributing building, and the applicants really wanted to add a new addition. They were also putting on a new concrete tile roof and replacing all of their windows to impact. So down on South Lakeside Drive, do you remember what the new base flood elevation is?
Their current zone is at 10, and the house is at 5.
Okay. So you can imagine taking this building, mid-century building from the 50s, everything's kind of low, horizontal, kind of streamlined, and then adding 5 foot of foundation under that house. It would have really changed the character if you could have done it at all. It's a slab house. Raising a slab house is a little bit of work. So what they did was the new surveys had their house listed as contributing. So they did a voluntary contributing designation on their property to become eligible for the variance. Then Abraham and I worked with them on their addition to get it to somewhere where we thought would be a compatible with the historic building while still giving them everything that they kind of wanted on the interior. It went to the HRPB and they were granted their variance. So again, this is not only a rehabilitation of a historic property, it's also an addition. And it was all able to stay at the current base flood elevation level. Okay.
Is it gonna get flooded out?
Well, those are the options you weigh. So their house was paid for. They were doing their addition in cash. They didn't have to mortgage it, so that was the risk that they took. I will say that we haven't had anyone yet come forward to look at raising their structure. That's something that we'll have to, if somebody wants to voluntarily raise it, that's going to have to be reviewed by the HRPB too. We'll just have to do it in a sensitive way. And,
After the first one.
yeah, after the first flood, exactly. But if it's something, if you're comfortable with living in your house at its base flood elevation level, this is something that's open to you. Erin?
So I'll just go ahead and wrap up. Obviously, the greater conversation is based in sustainability and resiliency. There are a lot of regional efforts to address resiliency, floodplain resiliency, climate resiliency. Southeast Florida Climate Compact, which is a really interesting case or interesting organization. It's a multi-county compact pulling data on climate, sea level rise projections, and potential impact. Really what we see in our county is, we kind of have this gravity-based drainage system. And so we're not going to see kind of the impacts you see in Miami-Dade County, probably within any time in the near future, but really what we're anticipated to see is a shift in hydrostatic pressure from our water bodies, which is going to impact our gravity drainage system. So that's great information. If that's something you're interested in, that's a great website. There's the business case for resilience in Southeast Florida. That's also a fun article. I will also say a localized study is the Coastal Resilience Partnership. Lake Worth is part of a multi-jurisdictional climate change vulnerability assessment. We're hoping this assessment is completed in 2021. It's paid in part for by the county. So it's on the county webpage, which is the Coastal Resilience Partnership. So we're hoping to help some better mapping and data to understand what our potential impacts might be and the timelines for impacts related to sea level rise, just to get an understanding of what we might be facing down the line in the future. Not related to this topic, but adjacent. So we're Southeast Florida communities all over, especially in Miami-Dade County, are working towards adaptation strategies. So we've had some shifts in our regulations. We know that over time we're going to see, slowly over time, we're going to probably see buildings rise. And Miami Beach, some other cities have started to do design typology studies that talk about how do you integrate these raised structures into the fabric of existing neighborhoods and not make it look so wonky, right? How do you address that? How do you keep that pedestrian environment, that friendly neighborhood environment, and how do you make those changes? So we're going to, now that the map change has come, we've been planning to look at it. Staff over the next year to 2 years is going to be evaluating grant opportunities once we get this vulnerability assessment data to understand what we would be looking at, and maybe look at some typology or some design studies that can give us some guidance for our residents. So when they do decide to elevate, or they are required to elevate if they're outside of a historic district, how do you make that work a little bit better, make it feel nicer, make it feel more like, still retain that neighborhood feeling. And that's really, we're lucky is that Dade County gets to experiment with that first, right? So they're really on the cutting edge, so we're going to definitely be taking a look at what they're doing, and Monroe County, of course, and the Keys are looking at those strategies as well, and then to inform code changes. So that's what we have for you this evening. We can go ahead and go to questions. So I knew you were first.
Yeah, you say when they're required to elevate, can you imagine a case where outside of the historic district, where someone would be required to elevate the house?
Well, we just gave you, all the cases. If they're in a flood zone and they do a substantial improvement, which is more than 50%.
Without a substantial.
Yeah.
If it is not a substantial improvement, you are not required to elevate with certain caveats. All new structures have to be to the new regulations.
Yeah. So, yes.
So, we've all seen for years how people sidestep the building department and do what they're going to do. But some of these projects have gotten larger and larger, and there was one that was being discussed last week on the south side of Bryant Park. At what point does the city stop saying, okay, just pay the fine and we'll let you get away with it? When we're seeing homes that are going past their property lines, building past their property lines, adding substantial structures that they've not gotten building permits for, and it's a year later and they still haven't. At what point does the city say, you're going to have to tear it down? Because the way I look at it, and we've always followed the rules, business and our home, at what point does it just make more sense for everyone just to sidestep and say, all right, I'll just pay the fine and move on?
So we have really stepped up enforcement with the building department and with code enforcement. Now we have city building inspectors driving around on Saturdays and Sundays. Okay. We had one particular job over they were stopped on Friday. Oh, we'll just come back Saturday and finish. We knocked on their door Saturday and told them to leave, and if they didn't leave, we were coming to get the police and have them thrown out. Okay, so we're really getting serious about it. The problem is we're doing 100+ stop work orders a year, okay? And we have to follow a process and procedure. We don't catch everybody, but every complaint that comes in, we will investigate. The burden of proof is on us. We have to be able to prove that they're doing it. I know there are people who have gotten away with it in the past, and we would love to say we catch 100% of everybody, but we don't. But those who we do catch, we are working on following through with it. That's something that did not happen in the past. We're taking 4 to 5 properties a month to the special magistrate, okay, to kind of clear up some of the backlog, but it's a slow process.
Can I ask a question too on the significant improvement threshold?
Yes.
Is that just a moment in time threshold, or is there a look back or a window? In other words, like if you're in the middle of a project, you do it some over a 2-year period of time.
Yeah. So in the regulations, there is a prohibition against dividing the project up into pods to make sure it's what we call job creep. Okay.
Yeah.
Where if it's one job that you're doing, okay, you cannot break it up into parts and say, okay, I'm doing this part this year, and then I'm going to start this part next year, but it's really all one project. FEMA looks very closely at that, and I do as well. There is currently nothing in the city ordinance for what's called cumulative substantial improvement, which is over a 5-year or 10-year period. They add all the improvements together. My guess is that maybe coming in the next code cycle, they were talking about it, every 3 years the building code is updated. They were trying to get it in the last building code, but there's a very strong lobby that got it out. So, it's very important to, be involved in your local, because again, this can be by local, this can also be by state, and it can also be by federal. But the federal isn't going to mandate cumulative. Your local would do cumulative. If we did that, we would get more CRS points and we could get a greater discount on our insurance. My opinion of that is, I don't think it's worth it because it would penalize so many people if you did the cumulative. Yeah.
So, and I'll just say, Peter threw some different code language at you, like he talked about the building code and then he talked about the local code. So there's 2 things happening. There's the Florida building code, and that's updated not by the city, but the city, all structures that are built in the state of Florida have to adhere to the Florida building code. This is a state code. It's a statewide code. So we don't have control we over the code. The code is the code, basically. But what we do have control over is our zoning requirements. So sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, I can't do that because it's the code, and they'll say, okay, well, let's change the code. Well, sometimes we can change the code, but sometimes that's outside of, that's not our responsibility, or we don't have authority to look at that part. And that's most of the codes, occupancy requirements, structure requirements, roofing requirements, that's all the state of Florida.
Is there some place you can look up the elevation of your home?
It needs to be on your survey. You're going to have an elevation on your survey. And so if you don't have a survey with an elevation on that, you can get whoever did your survey, they'll come out and they'll give your elevation.
For a fee.
For me.
You don't have a survey if you have a mortgage. Otherwise, if you pay with cash, you don't require a survey.
Right. So then you'll have to pay a surveyor to come out and give you what your elevation is.
You said something about, there were several years ago, they said they were going to change the flood map, and so I rushed out and got my flood insurance. It was like $400, and I think it was like 5 years ago, or it was
Correct.
a few years ago. And they said they were going to redo it, but then I don't think they did.
Yes, they did.
They
They
did?
redid the map in 2016.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so the maps were updated in 16, and now they're being updated again this year to include all the coastal studies that were done.
Okay, so back then, the flood insurance was like $400, as I recall, and I just got it with renewal. It's like $582. Am I getting the 15% discount?
Yes, you are.
but it's gonna go up again?
The,
Because
once the
maps-
maps change, okay, they will, so for any new policy, once the maps change, they have to go by the new rates. So that's why, you know, having a flood insurance policy, getting it early, you got the preferred risk policy, and they can only raise it so much per year until you reach parity.
But you may or may not have had a flood zone change depending on
No,
where.
she did have a flood
Oh,
zone.
she
Oh,
did?
absolutely.
Okay, I don't know where you live.
I live on Parkway.
Yeah, no, the maps changed significantly from the, there was a 1978 map that was enforced here before. Then you have the 2016 map that was adopted.
Right.
Okay, and that's the one you got your insurance before. And now we have the 2021 map that's coming in. So since I've been building official, there have been 3 effective flood maps in this area. You know, and that's going back from 2010 is when I started being the building official.
If you wanna see the map, where can you find it?
The map is published on the Palm Beach County website. It is also on the FEMA website. And, you know, if you call my office, I can give you what the flood current and proposed is for your parcel.
But you can also just look that up yourself on the county webpage. So if you do, you don't even have to wait for that. If you just go to Google and you do flood map PBC, Palm Beach County, it'll give you the link and you type in your address or you just zoom and you click on your parcel and it'll tell you the proposed, the existing and the proposed. And keep in mind, like we said before, we are required by FEMA to enforce the proposed. So the proposed is your active flood zone right now, for construction purposes, but not for, you know, not for insurance until they're adopted.
Any idea when they're gonna be adopted?
The latest, it was published in the National Map and Registry, which was in April, and it's usually 6 months from the date it was published. So, that was April, we're looking at 6 months from April, May, June, July, August, September, October, sometime between October and December. And I really feel sorry for those people who are not paying attention, because again, you know, you're not in the flood zone, all of a sudden you're in the flood zone, and now you're base flood -1 or base flood -2. That's a huge hit. Whereas if you get it now, like you said, you were 400 for your flood insurance now. 400 versus, I know people who have $4,000 flood insurance. And that's right here in Lake Worth Beach.
Oh my gosh, I'm like,
Yeah,
$4,000 for your flood.
yeah. Because again, it's a new policy, they just bought the house and they're base flood -2 or base flood -3.
So that kind of wraps us up. If you guys have any other questions, again, you know, we wanted to also bring both Abe and Jordan this evening so you can meet them, put a face to the names. And if you need to come and meet with us in person, we are available by appointment now. But if you can also Zoom, meet on site, and all of those other things. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, guys. And if anyone's really mad about it, we have Commissioner Herman Robinson out there. We'd love to hear about it. On your way out, he's holding court back there in the corner. So let him know what you think. Just to add my own experience to that, I have a contributing structure, which I've been very unhappy about for a long time. However, I did see the benefit of this because I did plan an addition, which you'd have to jump up 1.5 feet to get into it. So I was able to take advantage of exactly what they talked about, and I was able to get a waiver when I went before the board, so I could do that. You start getting into it, they're talking about the 50% more. It's a situation that changed, but for my small purposes, it worked well. Also, you know, trying to renovate a 109-year-old house makes your head spin. And these guys were great. When I called them, they would give me the time. I would ask them ridiculous questions. They would answer them with a straight face. They've been very helpful. So that's my little part. Also, what Luke said, though, is right. There's a lot of other things that come along with that. So there's a very large conversation. I would take them up on what they said. Give them a call. Ask them for help. Ask them for guidance. And if that fails, yell at Herman. He's in the back corner right there. Commissioner Robinson. He will take over